If you've got a question, could you put it into the chat, and I'm sure that we can come to it. I can see that there's lots of names from the fashion industry, which is fantastic. And Sarah's recording this, and this will go onto our YouTube, which we're starting to be using a bit more. So we don't have a huge YouTube, but it's definitely a way for people who can't make it on a 2 o'clock on a Friday to share. Yeah. So Nav and Swati are, to me, have been with me since the beginning when I had the idea. And a fashion roundtable before I launched. I met Nav through her work at UK in a Changing Europe, and Swati I met, I believe, at the Labour Party conference in Brighton a couple of months before I set this up, because that was November 2017. And Holly, Jade, you wrote into us actually about doing an event around Brexit. And I just want to explain to everybody that's dialed in, thank you for dialing in. We're not tone deaf to what the horrible news that's been going on. We will be covering that, and indeed we are covering that with our representation and inclusion work, but we want to give it the justice and attention. We didn't want to look tone deaf as well by doing something quickly. We have asked Karen to work on an event and her to curate that, because that is the right person from us. It's certainly not for me to take that space. But this event was set up, I think, at the beginning of lockdown. And I'm very grateful, because I know how busy Swati and Nav are. Yeah, there's been some new people in, but they've all managed to turn their microphones off, and if there's any questions, please put them in the chat for everyone. So Nav, if you could just outline, obviously I watched Newsnight last night, and the correlation between the impacts of COVID-19 and an extended lockdown on business potentially could not only delay negotiations, because I don't believe that anybody's saying they're not taking a holiday in August, and indeed actually arguably the British Parliament's holidays have been more than normal this year. Where are we at with it, and how likely are we going to go to either a no deal or an extension, do you think?
So hi everyone, and just kind of echoing Tamara's comments, thanks so much for dialing in and listening to us talk. Well, I mean, I don't claim myself to be a Brexit expert, I'm not, but I work at, as Tamara said, at the UK in a Changing Europe, which is an academic think tank, which has been working on UK-EU relations since its inception in May 2015. And I think I can safely say that for the last 3 months, the first time in over 4 years, been dominated by Brexit. So it's been a substantial change for us. But having said that, we're now at a very pivotal time this year with regards to the Brexit negotiations, and I'm sure you'll find that there'll be a lot more talk now about Brexit, both from the media and from the government. And the reason for that is because of the deadline. That's very the deadline that's approaching for extending transition. So kind of just answering your question, Tamara. So what has been said about transition and the thoughts about no deal and so forth. Whatever happens at the end of this year, we get a new trade border for goods and services. British businesses or UK-based businesses importing in the UK will face new trade barriers, come what may, if we don't extend. In terms of the actual negotiations on the two sides, it has been cordial, but I don't see it actually concluding in the next few weeks. I would quite safely say that we have a government. We have a government that is looking at the promises they made in the 2019 election to the electorate that won them that election. Don't forget those seats, the red wall seats, and there's a very deep article of faith that these voters had, and that was based on the fact that the government would just get Brexit done, and that means there will be an extension to transition. I can't see the government asking for an extension. I think Boris Johnson is very much playing up to that role of, I'm the Prime Minister who gets things done, I keep to my promises. You know, he wants to kind of contradict the previous Prime Minister, Theresa May, before him, who kept going back on her word. So you have the likes of David Frost, our chief negotiator. We have Michael Gove, who have actually said, both in passing, I mean, the government have actually hinted that they're quite sanguine about, ending up with a no deal. there's been nothing, I would say, substantial from the government to say otherwise. They're fairly relaxed about it. They keep saying it, whether it's on the radio or whether it's in on TV. They've actually keep thrashing against that. They keep thrashing the same line that they don't care if they end up with a no deal, that the UK will be absolutely fine with it, and that they're happy to rely on WTO terms. So overall, the talks have been sanguine. I think have been cordial. Sorry. And what we have seen as well from Stefan de Rink, who was one of the chief negotiators from before, has said that what seems to be the case is that the UK is just not budging, while the EU is trying to get the UK to be a little bit more reasonable and a lot more receptive. I think the UK is just being very just being fairly relaxed about it. In terms of the actual negotiations itself, the attitude that I've just talked about, but in terms of the actual negotiations, the two sides will continue to talk through the summer. I think David Frost hasn't exactly said that the UK is walking out, anytime soon, but the government obviously did hint that if no progress was being made, then the UK would just give up and prepare for a no deal. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens in the next couple of weeks. I think my hunch is that Boris Johnson, we might see a bit of a kind of a showcase of Boris Johnson going, meeting, doing a video link of some sort at the high-level negotiations if things don't formulate. And in terms of the UK's approach to the negotiations, it's nothing really to kind of, I suppose, nothing breaking in terms of actual news updates. I mean, it's kind of a pick and mix of EU precedent. The UK wants some sort of kind of style agreement on other issues, services, which is, I suppose, something that Swati will hopefully discuss a bit further on. But services hasn't actually been discussed as widely as we would have hoped in the negotiations. Mm. And this is really disconcerting, given the fact that we are a services-based economy. 80% of our services accounts for 80% of our economy. So it's really crucial that we get something substantial on this. And what David Frost wants is continued recognition of our qualifications, of our services. But he stressed that this is perfectly legitimate ask for a free trade agreement, but the EU is not really kind of flapping. Fisheries is also something that is, again, will not be concluded, but by the end of June, but it is certainly a deal breaker. Issues like zonal attachments, barriers. I think the Parliament also has 4 other sessions coming up throughout the summer on how to deal with fisheries. So slightly dull, slightly complex, but it's again an issue that that the likes of Boris Johnson and his colleagues are refusing to budge. Security cooperation is also another issue that has been affecting the negotiations, as well as level playing fields, which you might have heard about in reading in articles and so forth, and in the news. But basically, just kind of the short end of it, level playing fields they're basically measures. And they're often included in trade agreements to ensure that requirements are set in areas of labour rights or environmental standards, and that they've been maintained on both sides. They ensure that basically neither can gain a competitive advantage by kind of deregulating their domestic market. And this has proved to be quite substantial because again, there's still no agreement. UK still objects to the EU's what they see as kind of dominance over labour and environmental standards, and that is proving to be the problem between back and forth between the EU and the UK.
So is that because basically the UK doesn't want to adhere to the sustainable agendas that are of the best in the world of the EU? So
yeah, exactly. I mean, level playing.
Yeah, sorry. So that's something for all our sustainability advocates in the fashion industry to really understand that is part of the DNA of Brexit, is deregulation.
Yeah, level playing fields. I mean, it's not something that you kind of just throw around in the trade agreements. They prove to be a substantial. They're the backbone of any trade agreement. That's why it's just so important that the UK and the EU actually negotiate on something. Like I said, obviously the EU are not willing to budge. The UK is not willing to accept any level playing field from the EU as part of the FTA. So that's what's proving to be a bit of a stumbling block with them.
And what do you think about? I mean, we've done a snap survey, which Maria or Sarah can share here again, but has gone out in newsletters, just to try to get some data on the shortage occupation visa list. So we did a substantial piece of work last year on this for garment workers, and we've also seen that there are issues around the fact that fashion stylists, which was my job since the mid-90s, doesn't even exist as a job. So how can we argue for them to be on any lists when we're back and forth at the moment with ONS saying, oh, isn't it funny that these jobs don't exist? So it's very hard for us to argue. And these are obviously service-led jobs, industry-led, and under COVID, what I've seen during the work I did on PPE and procurement with the government is they want to come back to the UK, but we need non-UK workers in manufacturing, and yet the shortage occupation visa list sets would allow them the 20 points, but otherwise it's 25,600, which they just don't earn. I personally don't understand the lack of will to understand that highly skilled doesn't always mean highly paid. Where do you think that thinking in that corner of the Brexiteers has come from?
Yeah, I think it's, again, I mean, that's really going into kind of the history of why people who voted for Brexit voted for, for leaving the European Union. It's very much kind of like, we can stand on our own 2 feet. We don't need to rely on ex-workers from outside the UK to come in here and work for us. I mean, there was actually an interesting report yesterday from ITV about how there is now a shortage of seasonal workers, fruit pickers, and the reason being is the issue to do with obviously some of the kind of the movement of people, as well as and also to do with the negotiations, but more importantly probably to do with COVID. But there is now a shortage, and now people are saying, well, hang on a second, we never had this problem back when we were with the EU, but now with shortage of fruit pickers, or as you mentioned with the garment industry as well. So in terms of, again, as I mentioned, I think it just comes from that very kind of, Little England approach, standing on their own 2 feet, not relying on people outside of the UK to come in and work. In terms of, however, with immigration and what the sort of kind of post-Brexit immigration outlook we're going to have, it's too early to say, to be honest with you. I don't think even the kind of raw bones of what we're going to have post-transition hasn't even been discussed, it hasn't even been agreed yet. And immigration, as I mentioned, obviously you've got fisheries, which is going to prove to be, it might be a bit of a deal breaker, but immigration is also going to be a huge titanic issue that both the EU and the UK are going to have to deal with. And how is it going to be implemented? How is it going to be operated? The structure, it's a huge task for the Home Office. And the Home Office has always come under a bit of kind of, well, it hasn't always been the best at doing its job. But we obviously don't need a reminder of the Windrush scandal. We don't need a reminder of all the other kind of issues that the Home Office have gone under with previous Home Secretaries. So it's just too early to say. I mean, having working on Brexit, basically updating myself on all the stuff that's going on with the negotiations, there's not much being said. All we've been told is that the talks are still carrying on. It's cordial, but nothing has been concluded.
Okay, and my last question to you before I move to Swati and then to Holly Jade is the impacts of COVID a great excuse for the impacts of Brexit?
Yeah, I think back in March, it might be an end of March, I was, I don't know what, I can't remember, I was doing some work and I remember a reporter saying about the dip in the economy and what was going to happen for the rest of the kind of predictions of what was going to happen in 2020, and I thought to myself, COVID-19 is now going to be the scapegoat, it's going to be the excuse for everything that will go wrong with the UK, not Brexit, but it'll be COVID-19. and that's to do with the economy. That's to do with if there's any, civil disobedience, if there's any issues with trade, with the negotiations. The thing you've got to realise, and from a PR perspective, the Boris Johnson's government can now blame COVID-19 for everything that goes wrong. And people will believe that. And there is some truth to it. There is some truth. You could argue that there is some truth to it. But if you just kind of, go back before 2020, everything that would have happened this year would have been all about Brexit, and we would have blamed Brexit for everything. But now COVID-19 has taken its place. And in terms of the impact of COVID-19, I think it's going to be a huge PR management issue for the government. And it's definitely going to be an issue that the voters will blame for many of the, possible mishaps that we're going to have.
So do you think that had we had an election now, he would have got an 80 majority?
If we had it now, given what in light of COVID-19, I think the issue with Dominic Cummings has definitely tarnished the reputation of the government. I think it's definitely put a lack of, I think the voters have now lost their confidence in the government. I mean, it's still extraordinary that an official, not an elected member, an official, was able to hold a press conference in the Rose Garden, number 10. That's unprecedented. Yeah. So clearly there is a lot going on behind the scenes that voters are just not aware of that, and have now completely lost their kind of confidence with the government. Even though he's got a majority of 80, it's still a precarious 80. 80 is still not big in terms of obviously the numbers that we had back in, when Tony Blair was Prime Minister 20 years back. So 80 is still precarious. So in terms of if we had an election again this year, it's hard to say. I think yes. I think in some ways, I mean, Keir Starmer is still relatively new as a leader of the Labour Party. He's still got to kind of, make his benchmark and kind of let voters see who he really is and what he's about and what he can promise. People are still a lot more comfortable. Voters go with who they're comfortable with. And I think Boris Johnson will probably still win if there was an election this year. But having said that, it's likely that we will have an election in 2024. And who's to know what's going to happen in the 4 years' time?
Thank you, Nav. So I think what we'll do as well is Maria will connect with you, who's our researcher, to get that information for the about sustainability and the issues that you touched on, because there's such a passionate concern about that. And I would suggest that if you've got concerns about that, you need to write to your MP, many of whom might now be Tory if you're from all around the country. Thank you, Nav. If you just mute yourself, and we're going to bring in Swati. Thank you. I'm loving the green wall. Okay, hi Swati. You've also got DIY going on, or is it just me?
Yes, we had repairs going on all through. We moved in just before the lockdown.
Yeah, it's absolutely doing my head in. I'm literally in a corner because if you see anywhere else, it's bedlam. So thank you, Swati, for joining us. Swati is your Associate Professor of Economics, is that correct, at the LSE? And you've been with us since before I launched, as I said. So, I mean, it seems like a combination of multiple layers of economic potential disasters, and we haven't even got out of lockdown yet. How do you see the landscape that we're going to go back into?
So let me just start with saying that we had our plate full when Brexit was going on, and now you add a pandemic over and above that. So that's the level of economic crisis that we're really staring at right now. So let me make sort of a couple of points. One is, I'm going to just very briefly summarize what I've heard from, I also am a commissioner for the Economic Diplomacy Commission that the London School of Economics is running. So I'll give you a little bit of what we're hearing about globalization in general moving forward from COVID. I'll also then summarize for you some new work that we're doing, which is trying to look at what the impacts are of COVID on the UK economy, on UK businesses in particular, as well as how that sort of will interact or is already interacting with Brexit. So broadly, let me tell you, news is really, really bad. If you already sort of haven't heard enough of that, just to give you a very quick summary. So what we've been working with is the CBI data. So CBI conducts surveys of its membership, and typically when they ask most businesses, what do you think of your prospects for next year, for the next 3 months? Typically in April, most businesses would say, well, a little bit slack, 30% in 2019 said things were looking bad because of Brexit and all of these other things going on. If you look at this year's survey for April 2020, which covers most of services industries except financial services and pretty much all of manufacturing, what we hear from them now is that 50% of them think that business is down, and even more of them, about 80% of think business isn't going to improve after the next 3 months. These are really big numbers. This is sort of the really big peak we're seeing in the CBI data, which has been collected since about 2006. So things are looking fairly bad for most businesses. If you compile on top of that what we're also hearing from other colleagues who are going and doing self-employed people surveys, once again, very bad news coming from there. Most people have already seen a big hit to their income. Most of them expect that that's going to carry on for a while. So right now, yes, the government's protecting them to some degree, but how much that's going to carry on is really the big crisis we're in. So let me come back to one of the points you raised in the previous 5 minutes, which was Navjyot saying that everything will be blamed on COVID. So actually, the good news on that front is, and I don't mean it in a trivial way, I mean it in the sense that the sectors that we think will be impacted by COVID and the sectors that are expected to be impacted by Brexit, those look fairly different from each other. So in particular, let me give you an example. Recreation services, of course, massively hit by COVID, really not the sector we think is going to be terribly impacted by Brexit. On the other hand, when you talk about your own industry, textiles, say, or retail, those were industries that we think are going to be much more impacted by Brexit in the sense of relative to other sectors. This is a sector which is going to lose quite a lot from Brexit, while it's not necessarily the most impacted sector when it comes to COVID. So in that sense, some things are sort of balancing out in terms of the COVID impacts right now, but that's because we're still just coming out from what needs to be done to prevent the health crisis. We haven't yet got to the point that now the health crisis is over and that's going to turn into an economic crisis and a jobs crisis. And that's really where the government should be pushing. Where is that medium-term, long-term policy? And much more importantly, where are those sectoral impact assessments which were promised right sort of in the run-up to the referendum, that we're going to base our trade policy on the basis, on evidence that comes from these sectoral impact assessments. Those don't exist. In fact, we tried really hard for the past 1 month to try and sort of see what are the impacts that are happening with COVID, and can we try and see what the government has said from its sectoral impact assessments will be the impact of Brexit. Almost zero data that you can put together. Their sectoral categories are so broad. The 9 categories, health and education, are put together. Well, if you put health and education together in today's changed circumstances, of course, health didn't do badly. Theirs was probably the most busy sector last month, but not with education. So we're talking about really sort of trying to make policy without really being informed about what the changed circumstances today are, and much more importantly, where are those impact assessments, which is precisely what these things were supposed to be based on.
So why haven't they done them?
That's really sort of grim.
Why haven't they done them?
I have tried to look everywhere. My poor RA has gone crazy for 3 months trying to find these things and to try and get some idea of, was it really a matter of information constraints? We can't put these pieces of information together. I find that really hard to believe. If we as academics with very limited resources can tell you in much more detail across 30 different sectors, they can surely do at least as good as that. So I don't know what the story is behind why those impact assessments don't exist still.
Is it potentially that's been done and they don't want to share it, or it's not been done because they don't want to share it?
So I lost the plot on that one. At some point, David Davis said they don't exist. Then it went back to, yes, they exist, but we won't release them. Then it came to, we'll release them, and there are 9 sectors in there. So I think Navjyot's going to be better at explaining where those went. I can just tell you that even if you go by the government's assessment of what these different sectors are, the impacts, the predicted impacts of what Brexit would do and what the impacts of COVID already are, look very different from each other. Very different sectors in broad terms. So in that sense, you can tease apart. I mean, the government shouldn't be able to get away just saying everything bad happened because it's COVID. In principle, we can tell apart what those things are which are to be impacted by Brexit and which ones are going to be impacted by COVID.
So do you think retail, the bricks and mortar retail rather than online retail, will have more impact from COVID?
That's definitely true. So what we're already seeing, typically when you look at most of these survey data, you tend to find broadly firms in a particular sector say similar things. Not exactly the same, but they're fairly similar. We are seeing real heterogeneity, and which is why I'm even sort of cautioning you every time I say I can tell you across 30 broad categories, treat them as broad categories. There's a lot more detail involved right now, and we are not quite there, and the data is simply not there for us to give that level of granularity.
So do you think that the level of recession that we could be coming out of post-lockdown is, what's it looking like, the late 80s? Is it looking like, what is it looking like to you?
Yeah, so most of us are really, I mean, so Andy Haldane from the Bank of England actually pretty much put it like this in a recent seminar, which is that we are basically trying to avoid getting into the levels of unemployment that we saw in the 1980s. So that is really sort of the magnitude of the problem. Now, whether government policy can step in and try to do something really fast about saving jobs, I think that's really where the push should be.
And combine that with, what would you have imagined the levels of impact of Brexit would be on top of that, on terms of reducing the output opportunities from a country, not only that there's coming out of a lockdown, but also then potentially isolationist? Is there more opportunity for them by being a deregulated island off the EU, or is there more? Because can you see where I'm coming from? Is it actually a potential for them to make money in the short term by being that deregulated country? Yeah. Is that the thinking?
So broadly speaking, I still think that much of the assessment hasn't changed, in the sense of that, yes, there will be a further negative hit from Brexit. I think if anything, many of those issues have become much more salient now, because earlier when we thought of a no-deal Brexit, we still had at the back of our minds that the WTO rule-making body is well-functioning. That doesn't exist anymore. And much more importantly, that's not where the battles are anymore. Most of the sort of government rhetoric, as well as the expert analysis, a lot of it has really been focused on manufacturing, trade in goods, tariff barriers. And that's exactly what you were pointing out. Many of those jobs, those fashion stylist jobs that have disappeared, a large part of what the industry does is not just make stuff, which is tangible, but also provide these intangible services, in particular for a high-end brand. That is really the biggest component of things. So in that sense, what happens there, I think that's going to be a real clampdown across the world. So suddenly becoming some global Britain seafaring nation, going out and doing business with each other, with other countries, I think that's very, very difficult at this point. In fact, today morning I was in a seminar which was happening in the middle of deep, deep India. And the first thing that you hear, in fact, the entire 1 hour was spent talking about how they were going to go into making the local economy stronger rather than going out and getting open borders. And I think that sentiment is very much being reflected in most of what we're hearing from our Diplomacy Commission evidence sessions as well.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. There's definitely with the work I was doing on PPE, there's definitely a sense that we want to bring manufacturing back to the UK, and that was the way I was arguing it with the government. But the thing is that there are already massive vacancies, and because of STEM education, there's been a lack of domicile talent going into those jobs, which is why we've needed EU workers, which is why we need them on the shortage occupation list until such time as people can be trained into those jobs from here. Arguably, for garment workers, you don't need them on for more than 6 years, 5-6 years, if you can team up and train up people here, but you can't do nothing and claim to want a British made in Britain as this stamp, because it doesn't hold water. And also lots of multinationals, such as the company behind Zara, want to have local to market manufacturing in each of their territories. So I think that that's probably in line with what you're hearing from India and what you'll be hearing from all the territories. And also people, because of COVID, don't want to get on a plane to China, get stuck if there's another pandemic, had their goods stuck, have no end of supply chain issues, which I don't think anyone had thought. How would we have thought about this? Because this has never been in our lifetime, a pandemic like this. So I kind of can understand that for you as an economist, it's also having to force everybody into how do we assess local as an opportunity. And I think Brexit, your argument is, what I'm hearing is that Brexit on top of that adds another layer of damage. Have you got a builder there as well, Swati? Because I shut the door on mine. Is that your builder or the husband?
Yes, the builder.
I shut the door on mine. He knows, he works with us a lot. He's a lovely guy called Adam. Thank you, Swati.
I hear what you said, and actually I was going to come back to that point, which is, So this used to be very much an important point in the public debate. As, when I was sort of a younger person and I was studying economics rather than teaching economics, and this was something which was very much, it became reserved for developing countries. The developing countries should worry about diversifying their exports, diversifying their supply chains and everything else. But it never applied to advanced economies. And I think much more that realization has set in that there has to be some level of diversification. And I think that's probably a healthy thing that's happening. But the unhealthier aspect of it is that it's very much being done with this idea that we can be some low tax base area and businesses will come to us, will throng us, not realizing that there are also many other very much cheaper countries, both in terms of labor costs as well as in terms of taxes. And that kind of tax war is really going to sort of ratchet up even more now. So I think that really isn't sort of Britain's comparative advantage. That really isn't sort of where the industry should anyway be pushing, that it's not about low labor costs, it's about high quality. And if you're providing that by employing people here or by employing people sort of all over the world, I think that's really what the concern should be. So in that sense, I'm always a bit worried when I hear about sort of the same debates coming back, but with a very changed argument being given to it. Is that broadly answering it?
Yes, no, it's also because I remember Nissan was on the programme and I worked for Sharon Hodgson, whose constituency has Nissan in it, in Sunderland, and they managed to always get lots of press about if there's a no deal, they can, flex their muscles as car manufacturers, that they'd leave. And I think the sector needs to flex those muscles of what the impacts of a no deal would be. I mean, I've been trying very hard, and we're currently doing that SNAP survey to try and support getting the workers on the shortage occupation, because it does add the 20 points that I think are vital to get to the 70 points that are needed. So it's really important that we get that. Thank you very much, Swati. I'm just going to bring in Holly Jade. So if you just want to mute for a minute, Swati, and if anybody's got any questions, because I think it's a real honour to have Nav and Swati and Holly Jade on a conversation like this. So I definitely always want to pick Swati and Nav's brains about everything. I'm sure they're sick of it. It's probably like being friends with a dentist and going, I've just got a toothache. I bet you get it all the time. Or what's this gonna do to my business? Do you get that all the time, Swati, where people ask you, you can nod or shake? My dad's a hairdresser, and I mean, everyone would be like, oh, my hair, or the amount of times I never was a wedding stylist, but the amount of times I've had people the minute they get engaged go, oh, can we start looking for dresses, which is just not my idea of a fun afternoon shopping, is looking for your wedding dress. But anyway, that's another subject. So Holly Jade, can I bring you in? Hi, could you just break down to us what it is that your organisation do around this, because I see that you've done some work around COVID and around Brexit.
Absolutely, yeah. So we work directly with fashion companies, advising them on commercial strategy, and then also providing legal services. So for us, very much here, we've been providing a 16-point Brexit matrix where there's lots of implications to look for in terms of if we do revert to a zero tariffs, zero trade, zero quotas policy, or whether we revert to using the temporary tariffs regime. So I think the cost to the UK, the fashion industry, in terms of the potential export fees, or its potential import fees, could be around £870 million. And so for us, we've been particularly looking with some of our clients might manufacture in Italy, and advising them on how they can manage their costs, because the cost could potentially go up. The import tariffs, which are applied across, I think, 140 different commodity codes, could potentially go up by 8 to 12%. So we've been advising on areas such as the Common Transit Convention, negotiations around commercial contracts and currency risk, and the new import and export paperwork, changes to rules of origin and labelling. And
how much do you think, because we've done a lot of work around that as well, but how much have you felt that people have understood that it's all very well to try and get people on lists, but what about carnets, that you're not going to get one without the other, especially for a sector like the fashion industry? Do you think there's will around, because ultimately the argument is then, well, there's no point leaving the EU. So are you engaging with policy, or are you purely taking the information coming from government and then relaying that to your clients?
At the moment, we're just taking the information. My business partner Jeff actually works significantly in the Home Office, but for the moment, we're taking the information and relaying it to our clients, and then particularly advising, because there's so much to prepare for at the moment. And the fashion industry, I mean, we're really seeing a shift towards digital escalation, so increased use of digital distribution platforms such as Superetage and Dior. And then it's also going to be interesting, as you were saying earlier, on the 13th of May, the government announced that they were planning to access multiple free trade agreements across 80% of free trade agreements by 2022, and then perhaps there'll be more exports going out to Japan because there's more of a call as an entrance.
But then within the EU, we already have a free trade deal with Japan.
With Japan,
so we've had that for the last 2 years.
So how would that
giving us back what we've already got is arguably not that great, is it? And it's a small market.
Yeah, and for us, I mean, it's really, we mainly work with emerging independent designers. So at the moment, we're working on different applications to the Fashion Fund that's run by the British Fashion Council, and just looking to, because it's so drastically impacted the fashion industry. So we've had to do a lot around direct-to-consumer strategy, as so many showrooms have closed down, and making preparations for the year ahead. And so that's just also looking at how sustainable governance can continue to be incorporated into policy.
Yeah, there's another fund actually that the Creative Industries Federation sent to us yesterday, which was
really
because the BFC fund is tiny. It's 10,000 per new gen, and it's 50 to establish the brand. So I mean,
and they have to roll it. They have to bring it up to 500,000 before they can platform it again. And
it's not much.
It's not much at all, and it's really, I mean, it's really been quite concerning. So one of our clients had a contract with Neiman Marcus that has been cancelled, and it's just the ramifications particularly for the UK and for the EU fashion industry have been quite significant. For instance, one of our clients has a factory in Romania. And if the deal goes ahead, and if we leave without a deal, then import duties from Romania to the UK will go up by about 12%. And so for us, I mean, I think what you were saying about bringing manufacturing back into the UK is something that would be really important to lobby for actual investment into the UK, and to train workers as well. I mean, I know that there was a report issued in 2017 that the Ethical Trading Initiative looked at a company in Leicester, where a factory in Leicester where workers were quite significantly underpaid and subject to exploitation. But I know that there's a growing shift in just consumer awareness and consciousness that they care more about sustainable codes, and so the shift will be really moving, as well as adhering to policy. I know that on the 1st of June, I think 207 corporate leaders requested for the government to really make sure that any support for businesses and UK businesses integrated a zero net carbon emissions policy, and looked at the whole infrastructure of the investment economy to incorporate sustainable governance to avoid a kind of another recession that was due to climate change. So I see that's where we can really look at the procedures in investing in new technology, and also in looking at supply and demand and supply chain governance and the integration of new technology to improve transparency, and in that way as we move forward and out of this.
Okay. And are there any other points that you think are important to be aware of the layers of the impacts? Because I think it's been tough for businesses for several years, from the growth to online, then Brexit, the story that just keeps giving, and now a pandemic that everybody's in a state of panic or can't get to their, you've got shops full of Easter egg windows, and we're in June, so it's incredibly difficult for people. So
absolutely,
what would be your core advice?
Core advice, I'd say prepare for fashion companies. I'd say in terms of preparing for Brexit, look at ways to examine the rules of origin, make sure that the companies register for an EORI number, apply for the customs grant, because there's actually a completely underused facility, which is quite difficult for companies because they might not be able to access all of their information, but there is a grant of up to €200,000 for companies that they can access candidates across the board that to prepare the recruitment.
What's that called? And would you be able to add it in? Would you be able to add it into the chat? And
absolutely, yeah. So that's the EU's customs grant. So I can send that out, and I think there needs to be more platforms to support creatives as well. So you said you had a background as a stylist, and I know there's been, although the government's funded self-employment packages, and they've been extended alongside the job retention scheme, I think it needs to be increasing support for that level, for recognition of the photographers, and also increased governance of transfer of intellectual property rights as well.
Yeah, actually Alison Cole, who's an IP lawyer, was just on, but she had to go on to another call because I was going to bring her in. And I think it's very relevant because Maria and I have been lobbying on the unfair decision making around self-employed earning over 50,000 versus PAYE on any income versus company director paying themselves dividends. It's completely disjointed, and also self-employed only getting it for a shorter amount of time than PAYE, so it just doesn't seem very fair to anybody. I just wonder, have we got any questions? Could somebody either share some questions, put their hand up? Maybe I think you have to do this with your on here, because I'm sure there's lots of questions, because I know that I had some people emailing me just before we started. And it would be really lovely to bring you in. Otherwise, I'd like to go to Nav and just ask her for any kind of roundup feedback, if that's okay. Thank you, Holly. If you just mute, and then I'll bring Nav back. Oh yes, and we have got a question. Yeah, so Nav, actually I think this is going to be relevant to you as well as Swati. From Louise, hello everyone. I was just wondering, have you had some feedback from businesses based in Northern Ireland with concerns on the NI protocol implementation? And if so, has the implementation or non-implementation may affect them? Thank you very much. Nav.
Oh, I haven't, and I'm probably not the best person to answer that, not only because I haven't really had much
what do you think there is going to be a situation, so let's just break it down, and then maybe Swati might have some ideas on that one. Do you think that this whole Isle of Man customs area opportunity is going to come to pass, or do you think that that's going to be the escape route for regulation?
Yeah, I think it's likely to be the escape route for regulation. There's still a lot that we don't know about the NI protocol. I think that it passed very quickly. There wasn't very much on it. I think there's a lot more than meets the eye with that. I've worked on a lot with the, back when the negotiations were happening, with the border the trade border, and it's just so complex and varied, and I think that's also one of the things that they're discussing at the negotiations, and I think it's also something that's going to be quite difficult between the UK and the EU, particularly also with things that I mentioned before with the level playing fields. The issue is that the UK wants to take and is not willing to relinquish as much, and it doesn't seem as one of the reporters was saying a couple of days ago, was that the UK is very much acting like an 80-20 type of deal, as opposed to 50-50. Yeah, no, I think it definitely would be an escape. I think it does seem like it will be an escape route.
Meaning that if you were looking to get round regulation with your business, that would be your way in. Is that, or it's a way to, I don't know, it just feels a bit Wild West. And yeah.
What was the first part? Sorry, you broke up in the first part.
So do you think, if you were a business, would you be looking to have your business relocate to Ireland, Northern Ireland, get round tariffs that way?
Yeah, Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, whatever happens at the end of this year, we get a new trade border for goods and services. You know, British businesses or UK based businesses importing in the UK are going to face new trade barriers, come what may, if we don't extend. And I think if I was a businesswoman, I would be worried. There would be a lot of trepidation that I would have, because there's a lot of admin, there's a lot of concerns, not only with your staff, but also with the location of your property, trade, imports, tariffs. I think there's a lot that would be of concern for a business person. And what we have seen as well is that there are now so many new financial centres growing in the EU. London isn't as attractive as it once was. So Dublin being one of them, but Frankfurt, you know, places like that seem to be a lot more attractive than you know, before Brexit. So I think, yeah, there is a lot of concern.
Thank you. Swati, do you have any ideas about this this NI question? Because I think it's very pertinent.
So let me start with giving a disclaimer. When the Brexit negotiation first sort of we even started thinking about that stuff, I used to always think it would never go forward, simply because the Northern Ireland issue was so difficult to deal with. And unfortunately, I'm saying exactly the same thing even now. And the reason for that is that not much has moved until you see that real fine print. And this is true, not just, actually, this is not something specific to just the Ireland-UK relationship. In general, any FDI, any kind of movement of foreign investment will always have these issues. You don't know where traceability is. And in principle, you can register in a different country and you can skirt around a lot of issues, a lot of the regulations. I think that happens. And I think this is not going to be any exception to that in some sense. So we should expect that, yes, you can possibly have some way of doing something by creating a company in Northern Ireland as opposed to within the UK.
Yes, right. Interesting. It's very, for me, it's personally interesting because my husband's parents are Northern Irish, one's Catholic, one's Protestant, and they came here to escape and they voted Brexit. Like literally, I couldn't get my head around it. I haven't seen them for 2 years. So there you go. That's how deep it runs. Holly, your name sounds Irish. I'm wondering if you've got any insights on this from a perspective of business with Ireland at all, or am I clutching at straws there on an O'Leary? And you need to unmute. She needs to unmute. Unmute. Ask to unmute. Least text person leading these. Hi, Holly.
My Irish family are folk musicians.
Right. Okay. I wish mine were.
They've been quite reticent on. I doubt they voted. They kind of my mum and her husband Jerry go over to Ireland, but they don't hugely have an opinion, other than they probably would have voted to stay in the UK, but they're a little bit removed from, they don't have a television, and they're a little bit removed from society.
So are you advising any businesses to look at Northern Ireland as a potential way to get around regulation for business with the EU? Because I think that is, and maybe that's something that's fallen off the radar, Louise, a bit because of COVID, but I know it was something that's been muted because of this idea of some kind of Isle of Man border, which just flummoxed me. Like, we're going to have like a stop on a train that doesn't yet exist from Liverpool to Belfast. I just couldn't think of anything worse than getting all out in the middle of the sea, going through customs.
For the time being, we've mainly been advising on compliance with the rules. I think that when the time comes to it, and we see more evidence of that happening with companies, but mainly we're advising around compliance at the moment and how to integrate the new legislation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I think to answer Louise's question, it's an unknown, and a lot of this stuff unfortunately is. And I have a huge anxiety about Brexit because it's very close to the wire, and I think unfortunately the fallout won't happen until after we're out, and that's the worry. So in answer to your question, I think that Nav highlighted that, you know, there is opportunities, and so did Swati, of possibly relocation to Northern Ireland to get out, but it's not confirmed yet, is what I'm getting. Asia asked about the sustainability stuff, and we have asked Nav to send that to us, and that will be in our newsletter on Tuesday. I'm sure we'll get it from her by then. And then somebody else, Fiona, asked about PPE. That's on our website, so if you just put in PPE, that will all come up, what we've done on that. And I think that's it, unless anyone's got one. You've got 1 minute to put a question in. Otherwise, I think we'll end it there. But I mean, you know, we've done how many events around Brexit? We did the only fashion policy paper on Brexit when we first launched. We've done a number of events on it, and so many of the questions are still the same questions that still haven't been answered. And Swati and Nav and Holly and I and other people, including Alison, who works on IP, who had to leave already, have dealt with so much of this stuff over the last 4 years, and so many questions, whether they're IP, trademarks, services, trade, customs, carnets, even us working on the visas. They're very tight to the wire, and I you know, the reason why we're doing the SNAP survey is because it's so close to the wire, and the deadline is the 24th of June. So please do it. I can see Holly typing there. It's quite mesmerising. But thank you very much to everyone, and have a lovely weekend. I think it's week 11 of lockdown. If you've got any questions, please send them to Sarah which is admin@fashionroundtable.co.uk. And please do sign up to the newsletter, and thank you very much. And thank you, Nav and Holly, Jade and Swati. And it's sorry that you've also got the burgers.
Thanks very much.
I know what it's like, and what a time to choose when you've got nowhere to escape to. It's driving me mad. Lots of love. Take care. Have a lovely weekend.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Thank you.